In this session, we're going to be talking about some contemporary trends as well as some things that are pointing us towards what Christianity could look like in the future. And in doing this, we're going to be examining a variety of demographic statistics, both thinking about trends as well as potential future developments. And we'll start off looking at some things related to some global trends, and then switch to talking about some things specifically targeting the United States. And in so doing, we'll be looking at, in some cases, some very broad examinations of religion, and then also some things that are more specific to Christianity. The larger point I'm trying to get you to think about is trends and trajectories, not necessarily specific information, right? Specific percentages. Instead, I'm wanting you to see some overarching developments and think about what those developments are telling us. Because I think that there are some important statistics for us to explore, because there are some sizable changes that are taking place. Let's start first by thinking about the world religious population, thinking about where we stand globally, and thinking about where religions are in our contemporary society. So this chart represents the world's population in 2000. So as you kind of see, Christianity represented about a third of the world's population in 2000. Now again, very broadly, a lot of groups that would be under that umbrella. Islam, not quite a quarter of the population. And then you see Hinduism, and then those that would classify as non-religious. Now, that category we'll see as we go throughout this examination is a very broad one that encompasses some different things. Because we are talking about the world's population here, in many respects we can say a lot of those people that would be classified under non-religious would probably classify, most of them probably atheists. There might be some people that would fall under more of a guideline of spiritual but not religious, in the sense that they have some spiritual leanings, some beliefs about the divine or something, in a very broad, amorphous type of way. But considering this is the world's population, there would be a lot of people here in communist countries that would be more typically atheistic. And so, as you can kind of see from this breakdown, large portion Christian, large portion Muslim, Hinduism, and those that are non-religious, coming in behind it. And then you can kind of see some of the other breakdowns. This next slide, a lot of these slides, not this one specifically, but some of these other slides, coming from the Pew Research Center and the work done on religion and public life. Some excellent work done, and this is not even a small portion of all the studies that they have done. And other groups will also look at some things from Gallup, which is an excellent polling resource as well. So this graph, the one that's on the screen, is 2000. This next slide here is based off of Pew Research done in 2010. Now, as you can see, right, some of these numbers have changed. And the other thing to note is that some of the groups included in this pie chart compared to the other one are different. So, for example, this pie chart includes a representation of Jews. So, in thinking about trends between 2000 and 2010, the size representation of Christians religiously has declined. So 2000 it was about a third. Here it's about 3 out of 10. So a rather significant decline. Again, this is proportionate wise. The number of Christians has gone up, but as a representation of the world's religions, it's gone down. Different sort of situation when it comes to Islam. 22% in 2000, 23.2% here in 2010. Now, some of that might be attributable to, population size in the sense of greater birth rate among Muslims compared to Christians. But there's also, conversions that would be in that as well. Another thing to note, the number of unaffiliated people. Pew choosing the term unaffiliated because some of their research from 14% non-religious to 16.3%. The number of Hindus staying about roughly the same. Buddhists a little bit more in this, in this poll than the previous one. Other religions, you might not be able to make that out, but includes Baha'i, Jain, Sikh, Shinto, Taoism, and a couple other faiths. And then folk religionists are what was indigenous populations in the previous slide. So people of practicing indigenous African religions, Chinese religions, folk religions, Native American religions, etc. So that's 2010. 2015, Pew did another survey. Here again, the proportion of Christians has gone down from 31.5% to 31.2%. I don't have numbers from anything more recent, but it is quite possible that we see the same kind of decline. The population of Jews remaining relatively stable, but only 0.2%. All right, so a very small part of the world's population. Muslims growing 2.41% as opposed to 23.2%. And as you can see in the chart below, almost 2 billion Muslims in the world in 2015. Unaffiliated dropped a little bit, 0.3 of a percentage point. Hinduism going up a little bit, Buddhist dropping some. Looking at some of the changes, historical changes, and thinking about what is in the future, the scholars at Pew kind of have suggested that largely when we think about the next 45 years, so 2015 to 2060, Muslims continue to be the fastest growing major religious group, and that has been the case for quite a while. So expected to have a 70% increase. Christians about a 34% increase, but notice they expect the population to grow about 32%. So Christianity, according to the demographics, barely keeping up with population growth. Now, obviously, this is a model of if everything stays relatively the same. Could there be a worldwide revival where Christianity suddenly explodes across the globe? Theoretically, yes. Right? There have been instances of large numbers of revivals or large numbers of adherents joining Christian groups in revivals. But of course, we don't know that. So they're basing it off of current trends, and so quite likely we will see a continued growth in Islam, but not as much of a growth in Christianity. Again, we're looking globally at this point, but there's some similar things happening with Christianity as well, and we'll touch on that here in a minute. Numbers, as far as like projections, still projecting Christianity to be the largest world religion across the globe in 2060. But note how the difference, is gone. The difference. So, for example, 2015, around 500 million more Christians than Muslims. Projection of around 100, no, not even 100, about 70 million more Christians than Muslims. And so Christianity still projected to be the largest world religion, but not by much. And this is assuming all trends remain the same. If there is a sudden Islamic revival, or Christianity has an even smaller birth rate than what's expected, it could end up being quite a bit different. But notice as well the percent of the world population. Even though Christianity is projected to be larger, a slight gain in the percent of the world's population by 2060. Look at the Islamic gain, where almost as many Muslims as there are Christians, with the unaffiliated being the place where there's going to be a lot of decrease. Buddhism, some decrease, some of those other places. So, Islam is growing very fast worldwide and is growing very fast in the United States as well. And so again, if trends continue, we see that over the next 45 years, Lord willing, there is some big changes potentially in store for the world's religious population. This map from Pew in 2010 numbers kind of gives you an idea about what the majority religions are of a variety of countries. The red, of course, is Christianity. The green is Islam, and then the gray is unaffiliated. So, as you can see, there are different shades of each of these colors. With the darker a color is, the greater prevalence of a particular religion. So the darker red it is, the greater prevalence of Christianity. And you can see kind of, still North and South America predominantly Christian. Europe, Asia, North Asia, Russia, some of the former Soviet Union blocs, South Africa, Southern Africa, but then also a sizable group, Northern Africa, Middle East. Now, obviously, there's a sizable number of unaffiliated people in China, which is officially communist, but there certainly are religious people there. But these These are the ones that where we can largely see some of these populations. So these kind of give you additionally some understanding globally of some of the population developments. What population is breaking down in as far as Christians go. As you can see from the lower kind of bar, that when you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia Pacific, there are a lot of Christians who are in that part of the world, what we refer to as the global South. In that population, you have more than half of the world's Christians, right? And more than half of the world's Christians roughly below the equator. That is quite different than previous generations. I mean, certainly there were sizable numbers of Christians in those areas, but Christianity is becoming a globally South phenomenon. And that should be something that Christians pay attention to for a variety of reasons. And what's even becoming the case is because those populations are traditionally Orthodox. They are often sending missionaries into some of these places that had traditionally been the groups that send missionaries. So sending missionaries to Europe, sending missionaries to North America, because of the declines that we are seeing. Now, still from a number standpoint, by itself, Europe, Latin America, still pretty sizable groups. Europe still has a pretty sizable population that is Christian or identifies as Christian. But notice that when you take a look at like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, almost as many Christians in each of those regions as there are in Europe. Asia Pacific, more Christians than there are in North America, and very small minorities, still millions of people, but relatively small in the Middle East and North Africa. If we go even further by country, we can see, you look at the top 10 countries here with the largest number of Christians. The United States, of course, roughly at the top. But look below that, you have Brazil, Mexico, Philippines, Nigeria, China, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia. Right? So out of those top 10, you have several there, 8 of them that are not in Europe and are not the United States. And there's only one European country that makes this list. Russia would classify more Asia. Notice as well that half of the world's Christians are in those 10 countries, that the rest of the world makes up the other half. So we see here some very important demographic changes taking place. Remember, Christianity, of course, starts as a Middle Eastern religion, spreads to Europe, spreads from Europe to South America, North America, but now there were Christians in Africa in the early centuries of Christianity, but there were also a high prevalence of Muslims once Islam got started. Let's look at some demographic predictions. Based on demographic trends. Again, you'll find different numbers from different demographers, but roughly here are some important projections. So in 1970, there were 1.2 billion Christians in the world. As you can see here, 143 million of those were in Africa, 96 million in Asia, 211 million in North America, 270 million in Latin America, 492 million in Europe, and 18 million in Oceania. That would be places like Australia, New Zealand, some other places like that. In 2010, so 40 years, there were 2.2 billion Christians. 493 million of them were in Africa. So, about a 3-time increase. 352 million in Asia. Right, so about a 3-time increase. Almost 4. North America, however, only gained 75 million between 1970 and 2010. Latin America, about doubling from 270 million to 544 million. Europe increasing, but less than 100 million. And Oceania, about half, right? So going from 18 million to 28 million. So what do the next 40 years potentially hold? Well, according to some projections, in the next 40 years, the number of Christians will go from 2.2 billion to 3.2 billion. With that breakdown, about a third of them will be in Africa. So almost doubling again. Asia, about doubling, not quite doubling, but moving to 600 million, so a little bit over 500 million. North America, still increasing, but instead of going 70 million, less than 50 million. Latin America projected to add another 100 million. Europe expected to decline, almost 60 million. And then Oceania going up 38 million. Now, again, these are trends, these are projections. There are all sorts of things that could happen between now and 2050 if the Lord doesn't return to change these numbers. But it would require a rather significant change. Right? Demographers take into account a variety of events and developments and potentials. Right? So they do take other things into consideration. So, the kind of changes that would be necessary to, let's say North America to go from 286 million to 500 million. I mean, if there were even that many Americans alive in 2050, there would be all sorts of things that would have to take place for something like that to happen. Now we can take some solace in, there's a trajectory here that's positive, but don't forget those numbers of Muslims as well. So what are we seeing? We're seeing Christianity going southern. Right? That the new shift is to the south. And actually it's not a new shift. The shift over the past couple decades has been to the south. It will continue to be southern. Christianity will continue to be a global south development, a global south religion. And so when we think of, what would the typical Christian look like in 2050? The typical Christian would have darker skin, would probably be female, would possibly be on the lower economic side, right? It is not going to be light-skinned that is going to be representative of the typical Christian, right? If the stereotypical, what would the most likely Christian you come into contact with? And that's been the case for a while, right? When you look at those numbers for 2010, right, a large portion of those people reside around the equator or below. And that's not a bad thing. It's as Christians, we should be glad to see the spread of the gospel. But it does it should give us pause for thinking about our country, where we live, and what it's saying about what's taking place in our country. And it's, I certainly do not believe that the United States is God's people. God's people are the church. But I would like to see my country turn to Christ. But proportionately, more people are becoming Christian south of the equator. And I think that's reflected in some statistics that we can look at that are more directly related to the United States. So let's take a look at some of these. This graph coming from Gallup is a graph over 60 years from 1948 to 2008. There are a couple of things reflected on here. The upper line represents the number of Christians, the percentage of the population that identifies as Christian. And then there are a couple of different shades of green there. One representing the percent of people that are Jewish, one that represents those that would fit into a variety of other types of religion, and then one that is reflecting what is referred to as none, right? And so when you ask, what is your religion, these are people that are answering none. Now the nuns, as they've been called, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, the nuns have been growing over the past couple decades. You see there, if you can kind of see the line, that lighter green, that, in 2008, sitting at about 12%. Right? That's higher than, of course, back in 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, when it's like 4%. Now, those that are identifying as none, we'll talk about more here in a little bit. But as you kind of see, in 1948, about 91% of the population identified as Christian. In 2008, about 77%. All right, so a decline of 14% in the last 6 decades. Almost 7 decades at this point. Well, it's 7 decades since it was 2008. Now, it's quite possible that in 1948, some of that 91% would actually be nuns. And it's quite possible that the only reason some people identified as Christian was because of the potential pressures to identify as Christian. When you have such a large population of Christians, there's a lot of societal pressure to identify as a Christian, even if you might personally not believe some of the things of Christianity. But it would certainly be reckless to assume that population was 12%, like it was in 1908 or 2008. So we need to recognize there is a decline of the percentage of people identifying as Christian over the past several decades. On the other hand, there has been a rise in the number of people identifying as not being religious. I should clarify that it's not so much they're not religious as they don't have a religious identification. From other studies that have been done, these people are unaffiliated with a religious tradition, but many of them are still religious to some extent, still have some spiritual beliefs. They don't identify as atheists. The number of atheists hovers around 4 to 5%. Right? So a majority of this 12% are not atheists. Now, that doesn't mean that they are Christians in some other type of clothing. Right? No, these are people that have apparently come to a position of having some sort of spiritual notions, but for whatever reason they are not identified with a specific religious tradition. It could be that they are still following the guidelines, the tenets of a religion like Christianity, but they don't feel comfortable enough identifying as a Christian or as a Jew or a Muslim. Many of them still have spiritual beliefs, may even believe in God of some sort or some sort of spirit, but they don't go so far as to have a religious affiliation. So what does that mean for Christianity in the United States? It means that there is a growing number of people, and there has been over the past couple decades, in the United States who do not identify as Christian. Some of those are children of people that are Christians, some of those are children of people that are atheists. And about 4% of that 12% are atheists. So Christianity doesn't have the cultural power it did at one point. Now, it still has a lot of cultural power. Right? There's still 70-something percent of people in the United States identify as Christian. But there is not the same kind of cultural influence that Christianity once had. It appears, though, that most of those that are classified as nuns would be, the lower adult population. Now, this was 2012, so at this point we're talking about the millennials. We're not looking at Gen Z here. Gen Z had not yet, the earliest parts of Gen Z had not attained adulthood when some of these studies were done. So it'll be interesting to see, although trends are highly suggestive that we'll continue to see some of those younger generations as they attain adulthood, that they'll follow similar patterns. But 2 out of 3, this is 2012, 2 out of 3 millennials identified as unaffiliated. 1 out of 3 identified as unaffiliated. 2 out of 3 identified as affiliated. So a third of millennials, when asked, what's your religion, they basically said none. Now, as you look at those later generations, Generation X, as you get into the baby boomers, the silent generation, the greatest generation, those populations go up, right? The number of people that are affiliated. It could possibly be that as millennials grow older, that they will become more that population of unaffiliated will shrink. But right now, there's not a lot of trends that necessarily suggest that. There's no sort of indication as that older group of millennials moves into advanced adulthood, middle age. that we're not really seeing this. So it remains to be seen what'll take place afterwards. In fact, other trends suggest a larger decline in religiosity. So, for example, Pew did a study in 2014 of religious behaviors and beliefs. And so, how often do you pray? And for those that said they prayed daily, for the silent generation, this is prior to prior to World War II, 67% of those say they pray every day. The younger millennials, between 1990 and 1996, say, 39%. Attend services weekly, 51% of the silent or greatest generation, 28% of millennials. Still high numbers of people believing in God, but less than some of those older generations. Less believing in heaven, although, not a sizable group. The number of people that believe in hell, relatively stable. About the same percent, about 50%. So about 80% believe in God, only about 50% believe in hell. But notice as well, when they ask about how important religion is, certainly it's not surprising that those older groups, the silent generation, the baby boomers, more of them, as they're getting advanced in years, say religion is important, with the younger millennials, those under 30, 25 at this time, when it was actually surveyed, 38%. Right, so about 1 in 4. 4 out of 10. Sorry, doing poor math. 4 out of 10 say it's important, compared to almost 7 out of 10 from the silent generation. Some more projections for the United States. This from, 2010. Look at that decrease, and look at the increase of the unaffiliated. So the projections, if all things remain equal, if there's not a extreme, unheard of development, the number of Christians, the percentage of Christians from 2010 to 2050, so over the space of 40 years, declining from 78.3% to 66.4%. The number of unaffiliated moving from 16.4% to 25.6%. So 1 out of 4 people projected to be unaffiliated in the United States in 2050. Again, doesn't necessarily mean they're not religious. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't have some Christian leanings, perhaps, but they would be people that don't identify as religious. More recent data from Pew suggests a rather sizable increase of the religiously unaffiliated. Note there, and this is some of the most recent data we have available to us, a growth of nuns by over 30 million people, or around 30 million people. Right, so, a sizable group of people identifying as nun, and a decrease of about 11 million Christians in the United States. Look at some of the ways that this is reflected in some other things. So these numbers, most recent numbers, 2018, 2019, of the silent generation, 84% of them identify as Christian, only 4% identifying as non-Christian faiths, 10% unaffiliated. Look at that for the millennials. Right, 49%, half identify as Christian, 4 in 10 identify as unaffiliated. Now remember, just a couple years ago, a couple slides ago, the number of unaffiliated was about a third. And so it went up from a little bit over 3 in 10 to 4 in 10 in the process of 5-6 years. Look as well about the, now again, this is 2018, 2019, so prior to the pandemic, 61% of the silent generation attended religious services at least monthly. 35% of millennials attended at least monthly, with 64% attending a few times a year or less, and 22% saying never. All right, now that's, again, not just Christians, but that would include Jewish services, Islamic services. Certainly not the same kind of expectations in some other religions as there are in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But considering those numbers are smaller populations in the United States, we still see a rather significant change when you go from the oldest generations that exist in the United States to some of the youngest. Now again, of course, we're talking adults. Not much has changed as far as the overall population of United States Christians. In 2009, about 62% said that they attended at least monthly. 37% said a couple times a year or less. About that, roughly staying equal. Again, that's the total overview, not the breakdown that we saw just a little bit. Gallup has released some data. This is very recent data here. This is March of 2021 when I'm recording this video, showing that the number of people that claim membership in a religious institution, a church, a synagogue, or mosque, has fallen below 50% for the first time in the last 80 years. And as you kind of see, up through 1985, roughly, staying in that just above 70%. As you get past 1985, still kind of, dipping a little bit below. But then from 2000 on, there has been a steady decline in church membership, at least based on some of the information that Gallup has been able to pull together. So again, an aggregate of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, but it does represent that fewer people are identified with a regular religious institution, with a church. Now, for a lot of those people, they could still consider themselves Christian, or Jewish, Muslim, but they are doing so without identifying with a local congregation, a local synagogue, which certainly is difficult for religious leaders to know who's part of our flock, who's part of our congregation, who's part of our religious group at this specific place. Well, there's a difficulty there, and you don't know from week to week, right? Are those people part of our church? Is this group? And it also means, right, that if people, and this has been the case for a while, if people don't particularly like what's going on in this particular church, I don't feel any close ties to it, so I'll go to someplace else. Sometimes even of a different denomination. People not just congregation hopping, but moving between denominations, moving from one denomination to another. Probably not too much, just kind of skipping from Christianity to Judaism to Islam. Certainly there's some conversion, but we're not talking about that kind of. It's mostly going between groups that are roughly similar, right? So people, changing denominations fairly equally and not really having a thought about, am I Methodist, right? I mean, if I might have been baptized in Methodist church, but I'll go to this Baptist church, right? And I'm not a member of either church. So we do see a significant decline in the number of people claiming church membership. And we're also seeing, again, that decline of people saying that religion is very important. In the early 1950s, about 75% of Americans said religion was important. Again, probably a majority of them thinking Christianity. In 2020, dropped to about 48%. Less than half people think that religion is very important. They might think it's important, but not very important. Here too, probably still a majority of people thinking in the context of Christianity, although as we've seen, there's a sizable group of people in the United States that are not Christian. As far as yearly attendance, or yearly averages of weekly attendance, at various times it's been a little bit higher, but roughly people have said pretty statically around 40%. But notice, in the past couple years, over the last decade, that has gone down as well. Right? So the number of people that attend weekly is about 3 in 10, where it used to be 4 in 10. Now, this has been a problematic measure for a while, because as you can, see from the question, did you yourself happen to attend church or synagogue either in person or remotely in the last 7 days or not? So the pandemic skewing that last number a little bit, but still, I think you can see a trend over the last decade, even before the pandemic. What's even more problematic about this is it's based off of a self-identified question, right? This is the pollsters are asking, did you attend, and people are saying yes, or they're saying no. So about 4 in 10 historically have said yes. A couple of sociologists took a slightly different track. It's been several decades ago. Because it had been so static at about roughly 40%. So instead of asking them to self-identify their worship behaviors, they had people keep a journal. And what they estimated was that it wasn't 40% of people attending services weekly. It was about 20% of people. Right? So, the numbers of polling data, it seems like people might overestimate how often they actually go to worship, which means if that is the case, that 30% might even be off. It may be a lot less than 30% for last year. And that, of course, they gave the option here of remotely. So a lot of people, again, a sizable number of people identifying as Christian in the United States still, about 3/4 at least, but a lot of people not attending weekly. Now, we might say, well, that's not the end-all be-all of Christianity. True, but I think it does reflect larger ideas of the importance of church in general, right? Participation with a community of faith. And so I think that that's represented here in some of this information. Last chart here goes to the question of whether people believe that religion as a whole is increasing its influence. Now, you notice there, 1970, right? It bottomed out at 14%. Of people think there was only 14% of people thinking that the influence of religion was increasing. But most people believe in the United States that religion as a whole is not influential on American life. And I think as Christians, we should consider that, pay attention to that. We've talked before in other sessions that as we think about Christians in the United States, Christians in the United States have no idea what the influence of Christianity should be in public life. But I think at some point all of us that identify as Christians would say religion should have some influence in American life. Maybe that's not political influence, but there should be some sort of societal influence or social influence, right? I would imagine nearly all Christians would agree that Christianity should have some influence in the United States, even if we couldn't agree about what that influence should be. But a large portion of people don't believe that it is having that influence. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't. It could be having influence and people just having their perception be that it's not. But it does suggest that people in general are looking at the influence of religion and saying, that the influence of religion is on decline in the United States. So what are some things to draw from this? One is a narrative of decline. The number of Christians in the United States, or the number of people identifying as Christian in the United States is on decline. The number of people that are religious, probably pretty static, with the large portion of those being more unaffiliated these days. Christianity is not evidenced as much by people being part of a specific community of faith, a local community of faith. That the largest growth is not taking place in North America, but in the global South. And that there is a perceived decrease in the influence that Christians, that religion has in the public life of the United States. I think those are some of the major takeaways for us to consider. Again, not necessarily the specific numbers, but the overall trends and trajectories. Quite different than the 19th century and even the 20th century. And we can see how this decline through the latter half of the 20th century is evidenced in some of these numbers for more recent trends. So that paints a rather interesting picture for Christianity, but also suggests that there are potentially great opportunities for Christians to turn that around. Whether those are Christians in the United States or whether they are going to have to be missionaries from other places. There are sizable groups of people out there that do not identify as Christian that perhaps could be brought into a greater association with Christianity, whether that's as becoming Christians or rather that's seeing the benefits of a community of faith. So definitely some concerning trends if you are a Christian, but potentially maybe some opportunities that we have going forward into the future. We'll have to wait and see.